You know, 18 plus years ago when Lisa and I got married, I looked forward to a lot of things. You know, I looked forward to just spending time together and going on trips together, going out to eat and, all those things. I looked forward to, the time that we'd spend maybe, snuggled up watching a movie and, all those things. I looked forward to arguing with her. No, I didn't look forward to that. When we had our kids, and each one of them, and they're little, and we're holding our kids in our arms. I didn't say, "Wow, I can't wait till the day I fight with Charlie or argue with Darren." And I'm pretty sure they don't wake up saying, "What can I do to start a fight with Mom and Dad today?" But we all know those things happen, don't they? Not just in our family. In every relationship there are times when you argue with each other, when you fight, when you don't get along. And so you have to ask the question, why? We don't want it to happen. If you were to ask someone, would you rather have unity or disunity in a relationship? We'd all say, I'm for unity. I'd like to have that. I'd like to get along, not argue. Well, why is it then that we do those things? We do argue. And I think it's not too hard to understand that we have some wrong attitudes and actions. Attitudes, that frame of reference for acting, and then the actions that come out of them. And it leads to that. It's not the situation itself. There is no situation that causes an argument. It's how we respond to it. Well, okay, once we realize that, and we've seen this attitude doesn't work. This attitude leads to an argument, leads to this problem, leads to disunity. We should realize that by now, right? And checked it off. I'm not going to do that ever again. But somehow we still do. Why do we still do those things that we know are going to lead to an argument, are going to lead to that disunity? We can say it's our sinful nature, but all right, what's that mean? I think what it means is because our sinful nature is not just the things we do, it's the way we look at the world, we understand the world. I think there is some part of us, on some level, in some area of our mind that says, this is the best thing to do. Even though we've seen 100 times what it results in, there's some part of us that says, I'm going to react this way, I'm going to follow this attitude, this approach. It's the best thing in some way. Get what I want, to show them, to whatever it is. Doesn't work, does it? We'd like to have unity. We make choices all the time that lead to disunity. Why is that? And you might think, well, there's the key to this, to overcoming this, if I just had more patience, if we just communicated better, if I was just more generous, or you might be thinking if he or she was just more patient or more generous or communicated. And those things are important, but there is something even deeper. And it's what James talks about today. We're in James chapter 3. And we're going to look at verses 13 through 18. Not a lot of verses, but boy, there's a lot in these verses. So, James chapter 3, starting at verse 13, James asks the question, who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. Again, there's quite a bit there in those verses, and as we begin to look at them, our frame of reference for today, the main idea is living by God's wisdom looks like, and when I would say, what's it look like? It's one thing to say, I want to do it. What's it look like? It looks like attitudes and actions that lead to unity. That's where it's all pointed, where it's all focused. So let's go back and look at these verses in detail. Verse 13, who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. Now, James has a habit, and we've seen him, of going back to subjects that he's already touched on, or sometimes introducing a subject ahead of time. And you remember, he's brought up wisdom before, back in chapter 1, verse 8, where he'd been talking about, consider it pure joy whenever you face trials of many kinds. And he knows to do that is going to take some wisdom, some perspective, godly perspective on the situations around us that can lead us to not consider it pure joy, to miss out on how important it is to do that and to grow in our faith. So he says, if any of you lacks the wisdom to do that or anything else, let him ask God. So he's brought up wisdom before. He brings it up again. And we said there that wisdom, if you have to define it, and boy, it's tough. You look at different definitions and they don't always really help. Wisdom, I said, is the means to achieve a desired end. Knowledge, I know what I want to do, what I should do, and in that situation in chapter 1, it was I should consider it pure joy. I should persevere so that my faith can grow stronger. Well, wisdom is the means to achieve that desired end. That's what I want to do, what I know I should do. All right, wisdom helps us with the how. And so James says, who is wise and understanding? And in James' day, we see it in the Old Testament and still among his Jewish readers. For them, I tried to see, well, what's the difference? Wise and understanding. And it seems like there's not really a big difference. It's a phrase that had become almost one thing. Sort of like saying, fit and trim. We don't think, well, that's fit and that's trim. That falls under. No, it's just together. You're fit and trim. Well, wise and understanding. It's one thing there. And James says, who is wise and understanding among you? Okay, how do you know if someone is? James says, let them show it by their good life, by their deeds. We said when we looked at wisdom, you're not wise unless you live it out. You can be knowledgeable. I could ask, what's, pi to the 20th digit? And you may know what pi is to the 20th digit, but not tell me. Well, you still have that knowledge. You still know it. But if you don't live out your wisdom, then you can't say, I'm wise, I'm just choosing not to do it. No, you're not wise unless you live it out. And like some things we've seen recently, faith. You can't see wisdom until it's lived out. It falls in that same category. James says, well, the general result, what wisdom is going to look like in general, it's going to look like a good life. The life that God desires. It's going to look like the deeds that represent that display that. Deeds, he says, done in the humility that comes from wisdom. And so you see this progression that he's putting out there. He says it starts with wisdom. This godly view of things, of how to achieve a desired end. And he says wisdom then leads to humility. We looked at that way back in Matthew, and we said, humility, to be humble, is that idea of having an accurate view of oneself. You realize, what it is I know and I don't know, I can do and I can't do, my position, God is God, I'm not, all of that. It's an honest, accurate view of myself, and it's also that willingness to put others before me. So wisdom leads to humility, and then he says humility leads to deeds of a good life. Out of that humility, that accurate view of where I fit in things and that desire to put others first, I'm going to do certain things. My life will look a certain way. That's the progression. Well, humility, the word there is often translated meekness. In fact, the English Standard Version has that. And the two sort of go together. Meekness is strength under control. It's not weakness. It sounds just like it, but it's nothing like it. It's a strong person who decides, who chooses, who controls how they respond to a situation. In other words, it includes a warm and gentle friendliness. The New American Standard has gentleness for this word. And so you see how they all relate. I want to put you before me. The strength that I could demand my own way, I'm not going to. I'm going to keep that under control. I'm going to look out for you. I'm going to be gentle. All of that flow from wisdom. That as a Christian, God is God and I'm not. God wants me to live that way toward others. I'm going to choose to do that. I'm going to make that choice to keep my strength under control, to view things accurately in light of who I am compared to God. Well, James' theme, as we've seen for the whole book, it's the title of the series, is that God has expectations for believers. When you make a commitment to God, say, I believe in God and I commit to living for Him, James' book is basically saying, okay, here's what that should look like. God's divine expectations. This is what you should do, this is what you shouldn't do, and he gives examples of that. That's the overall theme, but we've seen some sub-themes, like any good piece of literature, and James is that. The Bible is that. There's the overall theme, and then there's sub-themes, and one of the sub-themes is it's not enough just to claim you possess a trait. You can't just say, I'm a believer. You can't just say, I have faith. God expects there to be specific results or actions. We saw this back in chapter 1, verse 26. Those who consider themselves religious. In other words, I'm religious, and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues, deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. James 2:14, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith, I've got faith, but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Well, today, James is doing the same thing with wisdom. That's why he says, who is wise and understanding among you? And he's not asking for a show of hands. Okay, who is wise and understanding? Raise your hand, I'll mark it down. Just was taking a survey here, want to know. Tell me if you're wise and understanding. He's like, no, that's not how it works. You want to know who's wise and understanding? Let them show it. I'll know if you're wise and understanding. Others will know, you'll know by what you do. Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. So James has been saying all along, you're not religious unless you do these things. You don't have faith unless it expresses itself in works, and you're not wise unless you live a good life and you have deeds that follow with that. That's how you know you are these things. God's expectation, if you had to sum it up, is live a life that's consistent with Christianity. Live a life that is consistent with Christianity. Stop and think about that for a minute. Really, I think that's any of the question we ask, what would Jesus do? This is really the heart of that. If you say, I believe there is a God, I believe there is a divine, eternal being who created this world, I believe He created mankind to have a relationship with us, I believe He is holy, and that when mankind sinned, and not just Adam and Eve, but every one of us sins, it breaks that relationship. Not because God's ticked off, but because He's holy. He can have nothing to do with sin. But I also believe He loves us so much that right away when that sin was confronted, He said, I'm going to fix this. What verse is that? There we go, Genesis 3:15. We know that one. I believe that I see that His love and His control all throughout the Old Testament. I believe that God Himself in the form of Jesus Christ came to earth, humbled Himself, lived here on earth a perfect sinless life, yet He died in my place. He suffered the punishment that I and every other person who has ever lived deserved. And I believe that God now freely offers that salvation. And if I am a Christian, I have committed to live for Him in accepting that salvation. I'm going to spend eternity with Him in heaven, and I'm living for Him now. That's what I believe. That should radically alter your life. There should be no doubt about it. There should be no one who knows you at all who has to say, are you a Christian? The life of someone who believes everything I've just said and the life of someone who doesn't should be radically different. That's what God expects. I expect you to live a life consistent with what you believe as a Christian, with what you've committed to as a Christian. That's it, if you want to summarize it. James then goes into detail and says, here's what it looks like. Here's what the religious side of that looks like. Here's what the faith looks like. Here's what the wisdom looks like. And he gives specifics. But that's the general thing. Live a life consistent. And so that's the first thing as we think about this today. Is my life different? Radically different than people around me who don't believe what I believe? Because it makes no sense if it's not. I don't really believe it if it's not. Well, another theme in James that we've been seeing over and over is he's writing to people who claim to be religious, claim to have faith, claim to have wisdom, but they really don't. I mean, that's what we're seeing. And every time the way it's worded in the Greek, it shows you're these people, if anyone claims to be religious, and the Greek wording is like, yeah, there are people claiming to be religious, yet not doing this, claiming to have faith, claiming to have this wisdom, but not having it. They claim to have these things, but they don't. What's the problem? And he says in chapter 1, verse 26, you deceive yourselves. If anyone claims to have religion yet does this, they deceive themselves. In James chapter 2:20, talking about faith, he says, "Are you willing to recognize, you foolish fellow, that faith without works is useless?" And we said foolish in the Bible is not just a matter of I'm not smart enough to understand. It's that idea of I'm not willing to give in and understand and see things God's way. And that's why he asks there, are you willing to recognize? Or are you so deceived to think you've got it the way it is? I thought about it this week. It struck me. Here's James, and he's writing to these. Remember, he's writing to Christians. We get that all throughout this. He talks about brothers and sisters. He's writing specifically to Jews because he talks about the 12 tribes scattered among the nations now. And so that scattered seems to be that they were persecuted. From what we can tell, James was the head of the church in Jerusalem. And after the persecution started, after Stephen was stoned and it got worse and they put the first disciple to death, James, who wasn't this James, this Jesus' brother, James the disciple, the apostle, the persecution got worse. Christians at that point, all Jewish origin, Jewish ethnicity, Jewish Christians, fled out. They're being persecuted for what they believe and for their religion. That was why the Jews in Jerusalem were persecuting them, putting them on trial, putting them to death. Why? Because they believed that Jesus was this Messiah they've been looking for so long. And because they did certain things that went along with that, their religion. Well, I thought about it this week. It'd be very tempting for those people to think, I must be living the life God expects. I just left my home. People didn't do that. We move around, and no one's from around here, and we might be somewhere else in a year. We just do that. They didn't. They'd been in Jerusalem for years, their family in their family's house, and they were just uprooted from that. Why? Because of what they believed and what they were doing in their religion. And so it'd be very tempting for them to think, I'm doing what God expects. How could I not be? Look what I'm going through for God. And James just points out over and over and over, no, you're not. If you're not doing this, if your religion isn't feeding the widows and orphans, if your faith doesn't express itself in works, if your wisdom doesn't show itself in the deeds of a good life, then you're not doing it. They're deceived about the core of things. They've got some of the externals, some of the superficials, and a big superficial. You can imagine being persecuted, being driven from your home, and still following God. But James says you're missing the core, and I thought about that with us. You know what? To think we are immune from such deception is foolish. To think there's no way I could be deceived like that. There's no way I could be living a Christian life in my mind and missing what God says I should really be doing. There's no way. If you think that, you're foolish. You're naive. As a matter of fact, in my experience, the people who are the most solid in their belief, people who know the Bible pretty well, who know, okay, God and the Trinity, don't understand it, but I know it, know the doctrine, that grace, not works, all those things. People who know that, and the people who are the most superficially active, they attend church and all the things they should be at, those are the ones who are most susceptible to thinking, there's no way I could be deceived. Maybe even the most prone to it. Because that's what opens them up to that deception. Let him who stands take heed lest he fall. And so as I thought about it, well, what's that look like for us? And especially this time of year. It's like, how many of you have heard people say, and you've read the Facebook posts, people just, what are Christians all upset about this time of year? Merry Christmas, exactly. I'm going to say Merry, as for me and my house, we say Merry Christmas, and we're going to say Merry Christmas. And they're upset at these stores that Walmart doesn't have Merry Christmas, or doesn't say this is a Christmas sale instead of a holiday sale. Or we're upset, and this year, it has gotten severely worse. There is something that has happened this year that has just taken it to another level. Starbucks no longer has snowflakes on their holiday cups. Their holiday cups are all red, and as Christians, we realize what a serious matter this is. I don't know, but you've seen it. Again, you've heard people talk about it. You've seen it. Starbucks did an all-red coffee cup, and Christians are up in arms. Now, I personally haven't seen any Christians up in arms. Seemed like maybe it's a marketing ploy by Starbucks. Would be pretty smart. But I have heard people who said, oh, yeah, my relatives are all upset. I've talked to people. They're just all upset. And I look at this and I think, this is the thing. To think, I'm living the Christian life. How do I know? Well, I am all for Merry Christmas, and I make sure I say it, and that I'm not going to drink from Starbucks Red Cup. You can bet that. We're missing it. We're missing it, and we think we're there. You know what? Walmart does not have a divine mandate to put Christmas on their sign. Starbucks does not have a divine mandate to have symbols, let alone not even just not religious symbols. A snowflake. They didn't have a cross on their cup the year before. They had a snowflake. And we're upset they got rid of a snowflake. Starbucks doesn't have that mandate. You know who has a divine mandate and what it is? We do. It's called the Great Commission. It's in Matthew 28. It says, "Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." I tell you what, anyone who posts on Facebook, they're upset about Merry Christmas or a Starbucks cup, and they haven't told their neighbor about Christ, has no business to be upset about either one of them. God didn't tell them to put Christmas on their sign. He didn't tell Starbucks what to do with their cup. He told us what to do. And if we're not doing it, we're missing it, even though we're doing these other things that we just think it's all that. We need to stop, look, and listen. And you know what? We need to ask someone close to us, am I missing it? Because I'm doing something else? Again, I think James talks to these people. It's the only thing that makes sense. They're like, we're doing so much for God, we left our house. But James says, yeah, but you're missing the core of it. And we can do the same thing. So he talks about wisdom in general. Then he's going to talk about the negative side, sort of a negative wisdom and a positive wisdom. He starts with the negative wisdom, if you want to call it that. He does. But if you harbor, verse 14, if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. And again, this is the Greek wording indicates they are. It's not if you are harboring. Some of you are doing this. You know, if you harbor these things in your hearts, I've talked before, the mind is what we understand, the heart is our basic commitment in life, and the will is what we choose to do at a given moment. The heart is also basically the seat, the place of our attitudes, those perspectives for what I'm going to do. Attitude is a perspective for living. Well, instead of in their hearts having humility and meekness, James says here, in some of their hearts, they have bitter envy. That's a self-seeking attitude, bent on gaining advantage and prestige for yourself or your group. Self-seeking. I'm going to get prestige for me or my group. Selfish ambition is the other word he used. That exact term is used by Aristotle of partisan political fights. We know what those look like, don't we? That is someone just looking out for themselves, their group. It's not even that you're wrong, you're just not me, and so I want what I want, not what you want. Both of those are the total opposite of humility, of putting others first, of having an accurate view of myself and what I know, don't know, what I deserve, don't deserve. He says, do not boast about it or deny the truth. And I read that, and I thought, who in the world would boast about it? And I think maybe that's not the best translation. I put on your sheet, James chapter 3, verse 14 in the New American Standard says, but if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. And that makes sense. It's not they're boasting about their selfish ambition. They're just being arrogant in general, the opposite of humble. And it's not a separate thing to deny the truth, lie against the truth. He says, and so, by being arrogant, you're lying against the truth. You aren't saying the truth is a lie. There is no God. There is no Jesus. You're lying against the heart of the truth. But what is the heart of the truth of Christianity? God is God and I'm not. And because of that, it demands humility. Remember when Jesus is asked, who's the greatest? The greatest is one who's like a little child. And he says, you won't even get in the kingdom unless you humble yourself like a child. It's the essential trait to realize I need God. He is God, I'm not. And so to be arrogant is to lie against all of that you're saying. There is a God, a creator of the universe. I've been created by Him. Well, then to be arrogant means to say, yeah, I don't really believe that. That's why I act the way I act. That's what James is saying they were doing. He says, such wisdom in verse 15, and wisdom in quotation marks. They didn't have quotation marks in the Greek, but the NIV is interpreting and doing a good job. He means it this way. This isn't really wisdom, just like the faith without works isn't really faith. It Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. It doesn't come from heaven. It doesn't come from God, which remember back in chapter 1:8, if you lack wisdom, ask God. All wisdom ultimately comes from Him. Well, this wisdom, like this, that's selfish and bitter, the ambition, it doesn't come from God. It's earthly. It's like a lower, inferior version. It's unspiritual. It's typical of people before they're Christians, before they have been changed and conformed to God's image. It's what the kind of stuff they do, the way they look at the world. And it's not just that it's lesser and lower. He says it's demonic. In other words, it's not just lower than God's wisdom, it's opposed to God's wisdom. God says do this, it says just the opposite. It's demonic. This is the second time in this chapter James has talked about something coming from Satan or demonic. Remember he said our tongue is set on fire by hell? And he says this wisdom is demonic. He's reminding us we are in a spiritual battle. It's not just that as people we aren't as good as God, as wise, as smart. Satan is working against us. Remember that. Verse 18, for where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. So this is parallel to what we saw before. Where you have true wisdom, it's going to result in humility or meekness. And that humility or meekness is going to lead to a good life, the deeds of a good life. Well, here he says just the opposite. If you have this false wisdom, this earthly, unspiritual, demonic, quote-unquote, wisdom, it's going to lead to attitudes of bitter envy and selfish ambition, and those then will lead to these actions. First of all, disorder, instability, upheaval, problems in relationships, and every evil practice. I like how he just says that. And every other evil thing you can think of comes from this. Comes from this false wisdom and these selfish attitudes. That's where every evil action comes from, he's saying. And I thought about how he pairs that. Disorder is on par with every other evil action you can think of. Murder, kidnapping, rape, lying, stealing, and disorder. They're all together there. And they come from this false wisdom and the attitudes of that. What's the point of James even calling that wisdom? Again, what's wisdom? Wisdom is the means to achieve a desired end. I think James is calling it wisdom, quote unquote, because in some way people think this is the best way to achieve a desired end. And it goes back, we're deceived. I really think being envious and selfish is going to get me what's best. Well, part of me does, or I wouldn't keep doing it. Because boy, I make some selfish choices. I make some envious choices at times. Must be some part of me that says, yeah, let's try this again. I think it'll work out this time. I think I'll get what I want this time. I'm deceived. And the actual effect of it is disunity. And that relationship that I entered into wanting to have wonderful unity with my wife and my kids and my friends and my relatives, I do things that lead to disunity. And I keep doing them. I'm deceived in some way. You ever notice how often unity is a focus in the New Testament? It's one of those things that sort of flies under the radar. What are the big themes? And we talk about forgiveness and grace and obedience and all that. Unity. And the counterpart, disunity, are a big focus. Romans, if you've had my Romans class, and again, it's not the predominant view, but I truly think Paul is saying everything he's saying to combat, to overcome the disunity between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. That's why he explains grace. It's like, listen, each of you are thinking of yourself more highly than you ought to. Well, realize you both deserve to go to hell. You both are going to heaven because of grace. Get along. 1 Corinthians, what's he talk about at the beginning? Some of you are saying, hey, I'm of Paul. Yeah, I'm the Paul Christian, Paul's party. I'm of Peter. I'm of Apollo. No, Apollos. In 1 Corinthians 12:13, again, a verse that I think is misunderstood, is mistranslated in a sense. For in one spirit we were all baptized into one body. Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, we're all made to drink of one spirit. You see, in every major translation nowadays, the S in spirit is capitalized. Remember that the oldest manuscripts we have are all in capitals, so it's a matter of interpretation. Should that be a capital S or a small s? Were we baptized into one Holy Spirit? Yes, we were. But in the context, is it better? Is Paul saying you were baptized in one attitude, small s, spirit? What was that attitude? Humility. Why was I baptized? Because I couldn't do it on my own. I deserve to go to hell. The only way I'm getting to heaven is by submitting to God, accepting His grace, and it's true for Jews, Greeks, rich, poor, men, women, whatever you want to say. So don't say, I'm better than you. And we were all baptized in one spirit of humility. Now don't go acting in the spirit of disunity, of arrogance. What's the true Lord's Prayer? We always talk about, let's recite the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, that's not the Lord's Prayer, that's the model prayer. What is the true Lord's Prayer? John 17:21. Jesus prayed to God that they, Christians, may all be one. There be unity. That's the Lord's Prayer. Well, and also think about it. If God's goal is unity, if that's His purpose, His desire, what's Satan's goal? Disunity. He's opposing God, and so if God wants unity more than anything else among believers, Satan wants disunity, and he's going to do everything he can to create it. And so as we think about this, do you realize disunity is not a small matter? I think many of us would put it down there. What are the most serious sins? Well, you got murder and rape and adultery, and we go down this list. I don't know where disunity would be on your list, but it's pretty high on God's. This passage in Romans lists sins. Look at these, and I bolded the ones that in my mind at least lead to or are representative of disunity. Paul's talking about these people that are totally alienated from God. He says they have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil. Greed is going to lead to disunity. I want something, don't want you to have it. And depravity. They are full of envy, envious of each other. Murder, I suppose that causes disunity too. Didn't highlight that one, but yeah, that's going to really end a relationship. Strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips. Wow, look at the company gossiping keeps. Murderers and gossips. Those don't usually share the same cell at a prison, but God says they're in the same boat. Slanderers, God haters. You don't get much worse than that. Insolent. So again, the list that the company these share space with. Arrogant and boastful, those would be disunity traits. They invent ways of doing evil. It's not just enough what we've had for all these years. What's a new way to do evil? They disobey their parents. Look at the company that keeps. They have no understanding, no fidelity. I bolded no love and no mercy. Look at that list and all these traits, these attitudes or actions of disunity. And in Romans 12:18, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you. It won't always be possible, but on the other hand, you can't say, well, that person is just to this, to that, to whatever. No. As far as it depends on you, if it is possible at all, get along. That's how important unity is. And ungodly, earthly wisdom undermines unity. And then Paul closes out verse 17, but the wisdom that comes from heaven, God's wisdom, is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. He gives a virtue list, and there's a couple other places in the Bible that have them. The Beatitudes are a virtue list. The fruits of the Spirit. Well, here's one in James, and it's no surprise. The focus of these traits, the effect of these attitudes and actions, is unity. It says, first of all, this wisdom that comes from God, God's wisdom, is pure. The worldly wisdom has an element of wisdom. I can see how I could get what I want with that. But it has selfishness mixed in with it. It's not pure. That's why James said in chapter 4, verse 8, come near to God, and He will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. And we said double-minded, it's a moral term. It's not I can't make up my mind. It's like I'm for God in this area, but not in this area. I'm for God today, but not tomorrow. I'm really strong in Him now, but not so much later. He's saying purify your hearts. In other words, don't have a divided heart. Have a heart that's fully committed to God. It's pure. Wisdom is peace-loving. Look at that. Versus the rivalry, the competitiveness, the selfish ambition. It's considerate. We use that word, be considerate. And the word means to not insist on your own rights. I could insist on this. Be considerate and don't. Submissive, readiness to yield to someone else. Full of mercy. That's withholding. Mercy is withholding the negative that other people deserve. Good fruit is demonstrating what's inside. Haven't we been seeing this over and over? Don't just say, I've got it. Demonstrate it. But notice also, full of mercy and good fruit. The others have commas. Those have and good fruit. They go together. What he's saying is, withhold the negative that someone deserves and do good things to them. Think that'll help with unity? Impartial. Don't show favoritism. That word, the Greek word, can also mean unwavering. In other words, don't be inconsistent. Like the tongue that praises God one minute and curses people the next. And then sincere means no hypocrisy. Sincere. No, I don't say one thing and do the other. And it's like a bookend with pure. Not like, I've got some good wisdom and some bad wisdom mixed together. I say this, but I do this mixed together. No. Be consistent. How many of those are related to unity? All of them, aren't they? Every one of those is going to result in and contribute to unity. Well, we want to say we're wise. I would certainly, who among you is wise? We'd all like to raise our hand. Here's the test. Here's the test. Do you have these attitudes? Does this characterize you? Are these your perspectives for acting? That's what an attitude is. I always make sure I act out of these. James then. Verse 18, peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. See where his emphasis is there. Peacemakers who sow in peace. The overarching trait of unity is that peace. We're united. We get along. Reap a harvest of righteousness. Remember, that's God's expectation. Back in James 1:20, he talked about producing the righteousness that God desires. These right acts. Not doing the wrong acts. God wants that from us. Well, he says this is how to do it. Sow in peace, and you'll reap a harvest of righteousness. And notice, he doesn't just say sow peace. He doesn't just say do things that specifically are, creating peace. He's saying whatever you do, sow, everything you do, everything you put out there, do it with this mindset of creating and contributing to peace. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's that overarching. James is taking these big principles and he's saying, here's what it looks like. And these are at the core. I know you guys have fled your homes for persecution. That's admirable. But it's not the core of what it means to be a Christian. If you flee your homes for Christ, but you aren't doing these things, you're missing it. What would he say to her if you don't drink from a red cup? Well, again, for us, how often is my primary motive peace and unity? Why are you doing what you do? I just want to make sure I get along. I want to make sure people get along. I want to make sure I have a good relationship with my spouse, with my kids, with my church family, my neighbors. This is another James passage that it's pretty easy to understand. I don't think anyone's head is swimming today like it was Tuesday from the premillennial, this, that, and the other. Pretty easy to understand, but boy, is it hard to do. Truly live out wisdom, to realize the seriousness of disunity and the primary motive of my life being peace and unity, that's hard to do. And it's even harder in light of what I see as the root problem. Just about every week, there's always something like, okay, we could get this, but if we just stop here, we're going to be in the same place we were. What has been keeping me from getting this all these years? Because most of us have been at this for a while. What's the root problem? And I think it goes back to verse 14 and 15. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not be arrogant and so deny the truth. Such wisdom, quote unquote, does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. Again, why does James use wisdom there? He could have said such evil attitudes. Because they are evil attitudes, aren't they? Selfish ambition, bitter envy, those are evil. Why did he just call them what they are? He said wisdom. Well, that's because he knows there's some people who think this really is wisdom. I'm really being wise here, and they're deceived. And we know deception ultimately comes from Satan. That's what, it's one of his titles. He's the deceiver. But we also know he can't do it to us. We have to buy into it at some point. And that's why James says over and over, you deceive yourselves. So what am I deceived about? And I thought about it. Either one or two things. Either, first of all, that my attitude isn't bitter envy and selfish ambition. And what's interesting is both of those phrases there, bitter envy, selfish ambition, they both have a noun that in and of itself is not bad. That word for envy can also be zeal. And there's times we're to be zealous for things. I feel strongly about this. And ambition, that's not a bad thing. But notice he modifies each one and says it's not just zeal, it's bitter zeal. And that's why it's translated envy. It's this bitter, I want for myself. It's not just ambition for something good, it's selfish ambition. I want something strongly, but for myself, for my own selfish motives. And maybe we're deceived and we think, oh yeah, it's not selfish ambition, it's just ambition. It's not bitter envy, it's zeal. I feel strongly about this and it's a good thing. And we're deceived and think, I'm standing up for what's right. And Satan's like, yeah, you keep thinking that. That's great. Look what it's doing. Or maybe we're deceived and we think the desired end isn't selfish. I know I'm doing all these things and I'm trying hard to get this thing, and this is for you, God. It's for your glory. And God's up there saying, no, it's not. My glory's fine without that. My glory is being harmed by you pursuing that. One way or the other, we're deceived. Well, what's the key to overcoming it? And I think the only way to... here's the problem with deception. If you're deceived, you don't know you're deceived. If you're just outright stealing, if one of you is a bank robber during the week, I'm pretty sure you know that's wrong. So we just got to get you to, change. You're not being deceived. You just aren't willing to give it up. But the problem with being deceived is I really think it's right. I think I'm on the right path for whatever reason. There's something I'm doing that makes me think, okay, you put it all together, it's good. James, people he's writing to, again, they were persecuted. They fled their homes. We must be doing God's will. They were deceived. And so I think we need to ask, what do my actions and attitudes lead to? How do I know if I'm deceived? Well, okay, this path I've been on, these attitudes that have been guiding my actions, these things I've been doing, what do they result in? Not what do I want to happen. Oh, I want to get along with my wife. I want to get along with my kids. Are you getting along with your wife, your husband? Are you getting along with your kids? Are you getting along with your friends? It says in Luke, no good tree bears bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. Each tree is recognized by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from thorn bushes or grapes from briars. Again, you can claim all day, I'm living the life of a grapevine. But if it's not putting out grapes, and if people are poking their fingers on what's there, no. Claim all you want. James' whole point all through his book has been, it is possible to be deceived, and the only way to counter being deceived is to look at the results. What does your religion look like? What does your faith result in? Wise? Let me tell you, here's the test for if you're wise or not with godly wisdom. You're going to have these traits that produce unity. Otherwise, you're going to have some traits that produce disunity. We can deceive ourselves at first, but there is a remedy. There is a way to counteract that. And so what do I need to do now? As we move forward from this point, I think what we need to do is ask, in every situation, what will this action or attitude lead to? What will it lead to? And we need to stop. And remember what James says? Be slow, be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Stop and think about, if I continue in this attitude, if I act out of this attitude, if I do this thing that I'm thinking of doing, say this thing I'm thinking of saying, what's going to happen? And it's not a big mystery. Just ask yourself, what has happened the 20 times I've done it before? Yeah, 20. I mean, just looking at last month. Because to think it's going to be different is insane. To keep trying the same thing over and over and expecting different results. Be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to get angry, stop and ask, what's this going to lead to? What has it led to? Have I been insane recently? That's what we have to do. And it's one of those things, again, it's not hard. There's not anyone here that like, oh, that would take more education than I've got. But it sometimes takes more willingness than I've got, more self-control, and we've just got to continually do it. And what will it look like? Every once in a while I end the sermon with that. When we put these things into practice, what will it look like? It's going to look more like the marriage that I was looking forward to 18 plus years ago, and the relationship with my daughters that I was looking forward to when they were born and little. And it's going to look like unity, the thing we all say we want. Well, what now? How do we start to live this out?